Welcome to All About Campion, an introduction to loving the films and sometimes the TV shows of Jane Campion. I'm Inkoo Kang, a critic at the Washington Post, and with me is my co-host Daniel Schroeder, a podcast producer at Slate.
Hey Inkoo.
Last time, we dove into the first season of Top of the Lake. In this episode, we're going to do things a little differently. We are going to discuss Top of the Lake's second season, subtitled, China Girl, which aired in the US on the Sundance Channel in 2017, as well as The Portrait of a Lady, which came out in 1996. Both feature Nicole Kidman, a longtime friend of Campion's, whose relationship with the director goes back several decades. In 1981, as a film student, Campion saw a teenage Kidman in a play in Sydney and wanted to cast her immediately in her graduation film, although that did not end up happening.
Wow.
Yeah. We'll discuss Top of the Lake second season in the first half of this episode and The Portrait of a Lady in the second half. Other than the Kidman connection, we grouped these two works together because they happen to be two of Campion's least critically successful works. Unlike In the Cut, which has now become something of a cult hit, rediscovered by newer generations, hardly anyone is out to defend Top of the Lake, China Girl, or The Portrait of a Lady, except maybe us.
We shall see.
We describe this podcast as an introduction to loving the works of the auteur of the season. But if you have listened to our podcast in the past, you know that our version of love requires honesty.
We have love?
Season 2 of Top of the Lake follows Elizabeth Moss's Robin back to Sydney, where she has rejoined the police department there. A dead Thai sex worker whose body is packed into a suitcase, thrown into the ocean, and ends up on shore somehow leads Robin back to Mary, the biological daughter she had given up for adoption after her gang rape in New Zealand. Campion has described the season as quote-unquote ovarian, and fittingly, Mary is played by the director's own daughter, Alice Englert. Gwendoline Christie also co-stars as Robin's goofy and seemingly inept partner, Miranda. The second season was written once again by Campion and Gerard Lee, but she only directs 2 of the 6 episodes. The others are helmed by Ariel Kleiman. Whereas the first season was nominated for a handful of Emmys, the accolades for China Girl were rightly few and far between. We discussed before how Season 1 was an interesting mess. Season 2, I think it's fair to say, is an uninteresting mess. So what went wrong?
The series opens on 2 people throwing a suitcase over a cliff, which we learn later contains a young woman's dead body. So unlike last season, we already know who's guilty of whatever crime has been committed. Robin is back working in Sydney, but clearly still has trauma from her experience 5 years earlier. Meanwhile, we meet Mary, played by Alice Englert, a willful 17-year-old who is dating Alexander, a.k.a. Puss, played by David Densick, a lecherous 42-year-old German man who lives above a brothel and claims to be a former professor. Mary, the baby Robin gave up when she was a teenager, has a tense relationship with her adoptive parents, Pike Edwards, played by Ewan Leslie, and Julia Edwards, played by Nicole Kidman, who have recently split up as Julie has started a relationship with a woman. We also meet a university student who is in love with Cinnamon, who is the woman in the suitcase who worked at the brothel, and he is distraught to learn that she is dead. As the show unfolds, we discover that the brothel Puss is running is also an illegal surrogacy ring. It turns out Miranda is one of the women paying for such a surrogate. At some point, Al Parker from the first season appears because he's suing Robin for paralyzing him, and he tries to strangle her in the police station. As things escalate between Puss and Mary's parents, Robin reconnects with Mary and becomes intimate with Mary's dad. Eventually, the angry student shows up at the brothel trying to kill Puss and then takes Mary hostage before fleeing. Robin and Miranda find him hiding on a beach in plain sight, and Miranda gets shot in the stomach before Robin can stop him, putting her in a coma. As the series ends, we see Puss and the pregnant sex workers boarding a plane out of the country, and the couples who'd paid these surrogates watching a cruel, poorly made film where Puss explains just what he's done. The families are heartbroken. It's a very Tommy Wiseau moment. Mary returns home. Robin drops by to check in on things, and Julia informs her that she and Pike are going to give it another go. And Robin goes back to her bleak, empty apartment to watch a home movie of a very young Mary dancing around on her laptop screen. And that's all we have to say about Top of the Lake China Girl.
So this is how Campion herself described the season. I wanted to go deep into the uterus of a woman and really tell the story from that point of view, from creation to appropriation. It was always in my mind that the ocean is the major uterus of the whole thing. It's a feminine space. It's controlled by the moon and the tides, and I love all that. I don't know how much it's affected how the story communicates to people, but it's there in my heart. And I read this, and I thought, first of all, this is some essentialist shit. And second of all, I bet Daniel would have a fantastic time rolling his eyes at this while he, in every other part of his life, is like ranting and raving about astrology.
Fuck you. But yeah, I mean, that's some nonsense. And I love that Jane thought that way. But like, if that had come across, maybe we would have loved this season. But you know what didn't come across? That.
So I don't know if you got this. I reviewed Top of the Lake China Girl, 4 years ago. Completely forgot everything about it. Including the fact that in the opposite of the U.S., where prostitution is mostly illegal and surrogacy is legal. In Australia, prostitution is legal and surrogacy is illegal. Which I think I was sort of like missing that particular bit of context, which helps sort of contextualize this a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't understand that either until like someone says something to the extent of that it is illegal, but that's not until they even like go to one of the fertility clinics. And so it's kind of confusing I would assume that an Australian audience would have more of an understanding of what was happening before we did. But yeah, I think that this whole series is really obsessed with pregnancy, motherhood, childbearing.
I mean, I think the first one was not as much. And this one, there's so many like really interesting ideas that are happening here. And I think that is sort of like the gist of that is sort of like the fuel that like gets this season going. But I think it just kind of like sputters out at some point. Number one, because the mystery is really boring. And number two, the second half, other part of all of this, which is like Robin's rediscovery of her nitwit daughter, is also really uninteresting. And I could never have imagined like watching a 42-year-old man groom a 17-year-old girl in order to make her into a sex worker be so boring and so unsympathetic. But that is what we have here.
I certainly agree. I only wanted the worst for Mary. She was such a nightmare character. It was so frustrating to watch her. Like, she wasn't making interesting choices necessarily. She was just making rebellious choices because she was trying to like act out with her parents, as we talked about while we watched this. Like, she's clearly just trying to act out to get attention from her parents because she wants the structure that they're not giving her. So she's seeking it from this like 42-year-old man who will kind of tell her what to do. But also like they were always seemed to like they were a little too scared to ever tell her what to do because they felt guilty that they weren't her parents. But like, that's way too much analysis that I'm giving this show because, like, it doesn't deserve that much because it's really just a whole boring stretch of, like, well, one side we have the crime going on and the other side we have Mary going on, and both of them felt like a burden.
Yes. I think the really, like, interesting thing that Campion is trying to do here is to connect the sex workers. Basically, like, she's exploring the exploitation of brown women's bodies here, right? There's this, like, really big, I think we're given to understand this, like, really big population of women from Southeast Asia, which is like not too far from Australia, who are working in Australia as sex workers, and like the exploitation of their bodies is connected to like the exploitation of surrogacy, I suppose. And I think that's a really interesting idea. I have never seen that play out anywhere else. And yet it just like is so uninteresting. In addition to sort of like the racial lens, there's obviously like a class element here. And I think there is a sort of thing of like, well, in the same way that like prostitution always might have existed, whether we legalize it or not, there is sort of this like similar thing play out where because now surrogacy is a scientific possibility, whether it is legal or not, people are going to pursue it even if they are sort of debasing themselves like in the process. Like, I understand all of this, like, and you know, like on an intellectual level, it's a very interesting leap. And yet the way that it plays out is so uninteresting. I think mostly because so much of the focus of the season is about Mary and sort of like the stakes of it is sort of like about like the intactness of like the like upper middle class white family. And there is not like a single Asian character, even though there is like all of this like hand wringing about like what white Australians are doing to Asian women, where there's like not like a single like Asian character that like feels real, that has like any sort of like individuality. I think one of like the ongoing dynamics of this season is that Mary is like the one special like white girl who sort of decides that like she can see through pus, and all of the brown women sort of like go along with him and consider him some sort of like charismatic leader, which I did not believe for one tiny second. These are women who have traveled really far from home and put themselves into like a certain economic arrangement. And if those are not going to be like the most cynical women in the world, I don't know who would be. I do not believe that they have like less savvy or like less like wisdom of how the world works than like a 17-year-old white girl who grew up in the wealthy suburbs. Like, yeah. I think that like the season is really like, we care about like these like extremely abject Asian women, and yet there is no evidence that like there is no like sense of personhood that is like endowed to those.
And yet
group of
I
people.
only know how to write white people.
I mean, basically, I think that like you spend much more time like thinking about you, like the general audience, like member, spend a lot more time thinking about like Nicole Kidman's like freckles and like wig than you really do about like any of the Asian women like as a singular character.
Oh yeah, I think that they are all a character together as women in the brothel, and that is just like the catch-all for all of them. And I mean, also I wanted to say, speaking of that class issue, it's interesting that like all of these families, well, all of these couples that are trying to have these illegal families have convinced themselves that these women are all students.
Yes.
And that like even Miranda, who is a cop, who is investigating this crime and is finding this illegal surrogacy ring, is convinced that like, oh, well, not my surrogate.
Yes. It's very hashtag not my surrogate.
Yes, that's the name of the episode. Hashtag not my surrogate. And that like, it's almost like they have no concept of the amount of exploitation that they are actually like engaging in.
Yeah.
And that like they think of it as like these women doing this altruistic act when really like, no, they have been trafficked into this basically, and you are a party to that. And like there's never any thought given to the women that are forced to be pregnant. I
mean, are they though? Are they like, I would guess that, I don't know if they're really trafficked in like the classic sense of the word. If prostitution is legal and these women are coming through student visas, I think it's possible that they can do whatever the fuck they want with like their student visas. On the other hand, we get
I don't know. Puss is actually loading them on a plane while they're pregnant and taking them out of the country. So he is trafficking at least the babies that are inside of their wombs.
On the other hand, we are told at some point that like any woman who sort of like works at the brothel has to like basically like the entrance fee for like working there is 30,000 Australian dollars, which like the incel character, who I guess he's not really an incel, which like the hooker raider character.
I mean, he's not an incel because brothels are because prostitution is legal. If he were in America, he would be an incel.
Yes. Which the hooker raider character says would be like 300 guys or like 300 jobs or whatever. And so I think it's a little murky, like the extent to which these women are trafficked. But I think that is like another one of these things where the ambiguity is not productive here. It just feels more like carelessness.
Yeah, because she was more interested in telling the story of Robin and Robin's like journey than she was actually telling the story about the people who were most affected by this crime.
Yes. One thing I will say is about Robin's whole plight is that, unfortunately, Al, the guy who was like running the pedophile ring in season 1, comes back, and I just did not care about any of that stuff, and it took up so much of the season, and I was like, why? Like, I'm over this.
I didn't need anything from season 1 except her just feeling bad. Like, I don't need Al coming back and trying to strangle her, even though the fight scene between him and her, with him in a wheelchair and her lighting the curtains on fire and stuff, was fun in a way. Like, it was exciting to watch.
It was stimulating.
Yes, but like, it just felt like pointless filler. And I think that same with like the flashback to Robin and Jono's almost wedding, where Jono's arrested with a girl on their wedding day, and we see like her burning her wedding dress afterward, and like, we don't need any of that. It's not like, none of this is informative except to like tell us why Robin is sad. But you know what we already knew? Robin is sad.
I actually got the sense that like Robin is in such a black pit in this whole season that I found it like really hard to relate to any of her emotions. I think with season 1, because she's so like driven working on this case, and because it brings up all of this like old stuff in her, I think that like even though the character is going through really awful stuff, you're sort of like, okay, like I understand where you're coming from. And with this, I think they sort of like overloaded her with so many tragedies that I was like, okay, I completely understand why you are a terrifying mess who like everyone in the police department hates, but also I cannot relate to any of your emotions right now.
Everybody in the police department hates, but also wants to fuck.
Yes, which like I also didn't need any of that. Like, it just added very little.
I didn't either, though I did find the cop with the mustache really hot.
You're alone there.
I know.
Yeah, I feel like it was like almost like watching like The Handmaid's Tale, like season like 3 asterisk or something. It just like got to such an abject level.
Except it was so much more pro-life.
Yeah, there's a whole like storyline where I guess like Robin, who like in season 1 had basically had like no connection to her biological daughter, now decides like, actually I am her mom after meeting her like biological daughter. And then her and Nicole Kidman's Julia sort of have this like tug of war over Mary. And I also just like did not care about any of that stuff.
Also, like, but once you've met her, it's like a tug of war over her?
Her? So yeah, there was just like nothing here that like felt really interesting. I think that like the stuff with Robin's history and the stuff with the case, like it just like relied on too much coincidence to like really like ring true. I think that even though it was supposed to feel like Jane Campion really wanted to get into this like idea of like Asian sex work in Sydney, like it wasn't actually interesting. It didn't really like humanize any of the Asian sex workers, which I was like, well then literally like what's the point? And then you just have these like random connections that just like go nowhere. There's like a whole storyline where like Puss's whole like motivation as a character seems to be that he is a product of a rape, like Mary, and Puss is a bastard, and like him sort of like kidnapping all of the babies at the end, these like desired babies who are born with the money of upper class white people, is that like he is like the child of like a raped servant woman, and so he was like, ahaha, here's like my revenge. And I was just like, okay, like am I supposed to care?
Yeah, no, I don't know how we're supposed to care, because like, I mean, I don't know, there's obviously no way to find him sympathetic, but also like I never even knew if I could believe that story he told, because it sounds so like fanciful and ridiculous,
like
that,
Anna
like,
Paquin's story in
exactly,
the piano.
that it's like he's concocted this history for himself as opposed to like what actually happened, which is probably much more banal and would make him uninteresting. But like, I also don't understand what kind of sway he held over Mary, because like he's not alluring, he's not attractive, he's not interesting, he's, I believe I said this while we watched the show yesterday, he's basically like an alt-left podcaster.
Yes, he is a misogynist who claims to be a feminist. So
exactly,
and that tracks. I mean, like, here's like another thing where like it's sort of like interesting in theory, where he really is good at like speaking the language of solidarity, of female solidarity and of female empowerment. And I think there's this like thing here that feels very relevant for 2017, which is how easy it is to co-opt like the language of feminism for like extremely misogynistic purposes. And that's like another zone in which I'm like, yeah, that's like a really interesting concept. Like, I wish you would do something more with it. And it just never really happened.
Yeah, it seemed like, honestly, this whole season was a lot of like false starts and paths that didn't really go anywhere, and just kind of like a collection of things that happened. And the only things that really like connected were a little too coincidental to like feel even story driven.
Yeah, I think something that we talked about is how, I mean, like, so much of like season 1 was about how inept and indifferent the police was. But here, I think most of the detective work, honestly, is done by the college student John. And so I'm like, well, I mean, I understand that like Robin is spiraling and Miranda is like way too caught up in all of her surrogacy drama to actually work on the case. And also she's not very good at her job. But like none of the cops are good at their jobs. And so I was like, what are they actually solving? Because they are solving nothing. You get like one version of what happened to Cinnamon, the woman in the suitcase. I think we find out at some point that like her real name was Padma, although, you know, all of this information comes from Puss. And so, like, are you actually supposed to trust anything that he says about, like, the illegal surrogacy ring that he was in? Like, who knows? And I think, you know, like, on the one hand, you can say, like, well, like, we should embrace ambiguity and blah, 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 blah. But I also feel like it speaks to like the lack of stakes and like the lack of like care that Campion and Lee have for like their whole like Asian side of like their scripts. And so it just like it just feels even more like they don't actually care about these characters except as inciting events for Robin's pain. One thing I will say is that in the sort of like press tour that Jane Campion did for like before the season came out, she talked a lot about how she wanted to go interview people who work in brothels, and she apparently got like notes about like the brothel scenes from sex workers themselves. I don't think that she talked like at length about what she actually ended up changing or anything like that. I think one thing that she learned was that there actually isn't like a huge amount of like forced trafficking. And like that was interesting to her, but that was like the only thing that I saw.
I mean, that makes sense, honestly.
Yeah, and she was like, I really want to get into like the combination of racism and misogyny.
Well, then why didn't she?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I just feel like this whole season is a season of missed opportunities in so many ways. Like, it's a beautiful season for some of the camera work, but as I think you said during one particular shot, like, this show isn't interesting enough for that beautiful of a shot. And, like, that's kind of the whole vibe of the season, in that, like, it doesn't seem to have any of even, like, the same... I hate to say this, but like magic of the first season. It doesn't have any of the same like weirdness to it in the way that like the women in Paradise in the first season kind of existed in this like alternate world space kind of thing.
I mean, I think you get that a little bit with this sort of like overarching thing that she's trying to do, which is that she wants to talk about how motherhood and maternal love will make you do some crazy ass shit, like take your egg and your husband's sperm and like mix it together and put it into the bodies of strangers. I think the sense of like that desperation, and like the intensity of feeling that will make you do all of this stuff that like you never thought you would do. These like very middle class people going outside of the law and spending tens of thousands of dollars to make this happen. I think that's really interesting. One of these surrogacy couples is sort of like with a woman who appears to be very like emotionally fragile, and she has this like very overbearing husband who tells Robin at some point like, having a baby is going to fix her. And this is like one of those things where I'm just like, that's such an interesting concept. Like, do more.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, honestly, for me, one of the most affecting scenes of the whole season was when Robin was sitting having that conversation with the fertility doctor, and he pulls out the dice, and he's just like, you got a 1 in 20 chance at your age. Pick a number, and they start rolling it, but you changed your number. And it's like a really sad scene of like, it really is this difficult to have kids this late. And so like, as you said, I would much like, there are so many interesting things about like the fertility story of like people desperate to get pregnant that like is yet another thing she's uninterested in getting into because she wanted to spend more time making her kid do weird stuff on screen. Yes.
Let me read you a classic Campion quote.
Love it.
Another thing that I found really interesting that I think maybe is a little bit harder to get, but like maybe not. I think it depends a lot on where in the US you live. She says the idealization of the Asian girl is so big in the Australian male psyche. It's such a myth, so unreal. They're tough ladies, not so submissive.
Yeah, I've watched Holy Smoke.
In a different interview, she said they think Asian women are more petite, more beautiful, more feminine than us big white women.
Ooh, Jane. Ooh.
I mean, we talked a lot when we were talking about like the piano, about sort of like this like distinction between like a special like white lady and then all of these like other women of color. And I feel like there's a little bit of like that particular dynamic with this season.
Oh, definitely. And the white lady that I actually wanted to talk about next was Nicole Kidman, who we haven't talked about enough, but also like is kind of as present as GJ was in the last season, which is not at all ever, and she's just kind of like there to wear a wig every few scenes. Yes.
I read a description that Campion had of Nicole Kidman's character, which I found strange. She said of Kidman, she's unafraid to play this ridiculous woman. sort of bossy, dominating, entitled, an old-fashioned glamour pot feminist with a fire in her eye. And I just thought, I don't know if any of that was really supposed to come through.
It didn't. I felt like Nicole Kidman was doing a Jane Campion impression the whole time.
I wondered about that, although I don't think that is what was happening. Apparently, you and I talked a lot about those distracting freckles that Kidman wears in this. And of course, she has a wig. Did you also know that she had fake teeth and a bump on her nose?
I didn't know about the bump, though. I mean, she loves nose work. Look at the hours. But I did know about the gap in the teeth because I had read some interview in Vulture where, like, the first sketch of the character, the makeup artist had, like, put a gap tooth in there, and Nicole was just like, yes, that's great. It was nice to hear Nicole's Australian accent and not hear her try to do an accent.
Her American accent, which is
any accent at all.
What do you mean? She has such a stellar Russian accent.
You're so right. What was it? Sorry, excuse me. I just, don't understand what the point of casting Nicole Kidman in this was. Because, she's not very present. She doesn't do a lot. She is kind of in the same way that Holly Hunter is just kind of there, but in a way that's, not useful or satisfying.
Yeah, I just don't know, what Nicole Kidman was there for. And I think GJ at least added a lot of, atmosphere and a lot of, tension, and there just really wasn't anything here. And one of the things that we learned by the end is that Mary's father, Pike, decides, who was going to divorce Julia, Kidman's character, decides that he's actually going to go back and stay together, sort of thus excluding Robin from the family that without her would not have existed. And yet at the same time, I just never knew that was supposed to be something that we were supposed to care about.
Or hope for.
Yes. And so I was okay, that's nice, but why am I supposed to care? And I just feel I had that sense at so many junctures watching this season. So did we like anything about China Girl? I will say I did like one thing, which was, as a woman who is of average height, but is often thought of as a short person, I am always paying attention to height, especially in movies. And I did love the height differential between Elizabeth Moss and Gwendoline Christie. I think they have about a foot in difference. And Campion really makes full use of that.
Oh, yeah, that was great. And actually, I think playing off of that, my favorite scene in the entire series, in the entire second season, I think really has to do with their height differential, in that they're at the beach and Gwendoline Christie hops down off of a ledge that's probably 3 feet tall, onto the beach, and then turns around and holds her arms up, offering to catch Robin as she jumps down. And it's just such a perfect
Elizabeth
image.
Moss is a child.
Exactly. It's so comedic, and but it's also so innocent.
Yeah.
Gwendoline Christie plays it in such a sweet, naive way that's just kind of aw. So.
Aw, you dummy.
Exactly.
One thing I will say on a final note about the incels or the hooker raiders or whatever is that I did find it really funny that at some point Puss runs into one of them and is like, let me guess, you're majoring in either philosophy or IT.
So fucking true. You know who majored in philosophy? My little brother.
The Portrait of a Lady was Campion's follow-up to The Piano, a film whose mega success heralded the arrival of a new, fresh, and distinctively feminine voice in the world of international art house cinema. You can imagine that especially after Holly Hunter and Anna Paquin's Oscars for Best Actress and Best Supporting Actress for that film, that every female thespian in Hollywood wanted to work with Campion. But the director, working with screenwriter Laura Jones, shaped her adaptation of Henry James's 1881 novel with only one actress in mind, Nicole Kidman. We talked in our piano episode about Campion's later ambivalence toward Ada's happy ending. Personally, we loved that the film concluded with Ada getting to, in Liz Lemon parlance, have it all. But
things are happening.
But hindsight made Campion think that she had acquiesced to commercial pressures. In her mind, the story should have ended with Ada's successful suicide attempt. The film's romanticism, she later thought, had fucked up heaps of women. Direct quote. In that sense, The Portrait of a Lady was a corrective to The Piano. Campion was drawn to the Henry James novel because, in her estimation, he tore apart the fairy tale. He's saying, be real, life is hard, no one's going to get the right person. Very good GJ speak right there.
Bummer.
If you want to hear a real bummer, The Portrait of a Lady is dedicated to Campion's son Jasper, who was born in 1993 and only lived 12 days. The reception to The Portrait of a Lady was decidedly mixed. It's a sumptuous, big-budget costume drama with some real art school flourishes that Daniel and I actually loved.
Did you know Jane Campion went to film school?
But they were not received well by critics at the time. Campion, our favorite adaptation queen, also made some significant changes to James's novel, in part to make Kidman's Isabel Archer more like herself, which also did not go over very well in the mid-90s when faithful period dramas were all the rage. Kidman, who had starred in Gus Van Sant's To Die For the year before, is terrific here, but nearly all the acting accolades went to her co-stars Barbara Hershey and Martin Donovan, one of whom definitely deserved those accolades, and one of whom I would say did not. In addition to Kidman, who was a big rising star at the time, and Hershey and Donovan, this is a stacked cast. It's got John Malkovich, Mary Louise Parker, Shelley Winters, Shelley Duvall, Richard E. Grant, Christian Bale, Viggo Mortensen, a veritable who's who in white Hollywood.
The film opens on a voiceover of New Zealand women talking about love and a silent sequence of these women staring into camera over the credits, and then cuts to a close-up of Isabel Archer, played by Nicole Kidman. She is being pursued by a handful of suitors in England while staying with her uncle, but turns them all down. After her uncle dies, she inherits a hefty sum because, unbeknownst to her, her cousin Ralph Touchett, played by Martin Donovan, convinced her uncle to leave her that sum so she could be independent. He is clearly in love with her. Also, he has consumption. Isabel meets Madame Serena, played by Barbara Hershey, and becomes instant friends with her, but once Serena learns of her wealth, she schemes to set her up with Gilbert Osmond, played by John Malkovich, Serena's former lover. Isabel and Gilbert get engaged, and Ralph tries to intervene, warning Isabel that Gilbert isn't the man she wants him to be. Isabel doesn't listen and gets married to him anyway. A year later in Rome, the marriage has gone south, and Gilbert has become very controlling. There's also a side plot with Gilbert's daughter that isn't really relevant, except that we learn his daughter's mother is Serena. When Isabel hears news that Ralph is dying, she tries to leave for England, but Gilbert won't allow it. Serena confesses to Isabel that Ralph convinced his uncle to leave her the money, and so Isabel defies her husband and runs to Ralph's deathbed, confessing her love for him and kisses him before he dies. At his funeral, a former suitor comes on to Isabel, and they kiss before she runs away back to the house, turning at the door and staring back into the garden.
So we've talked about the poorly received Campion films before. Holy Smoke, In the Cut, definitely Portrait of a Lady. I think that for me, this is closer to a In the Cut than a Holy Smoke, by which I mean I think Holy Smoke is a very good film that just was too weird for mainstream critics and audiences at the time. I think it's closer to an In the Cut, by which I mean this is a pretty flawed film that has some real interesting stuff in it. But also I understand why people didn't cotton to it, and it just doesn't quite cohere together.
Oh yeah, I would totally agree. I think that Holy Smoke is a movie I would like actually recommend people watch, but this is one that I would say like if you're into Campion and want to do a like full Campion
It's
watch,
for the
then
completists.
you should. Yeah, it's for a completist, and there's some really satisfying stuff in here if you are a completist. But like, I wouldn't have wanted to sit down with this just on a weekend without the rest of her filmography in my head.
Yeah, I think Campion does this like really interesting thing where she is like both really drawn to romanticism and she's also really drawn to tearing apart these like really idealized notions of love. So like on the more romantic part, we have the piano and we have Bright Star. And then she has these other films that are basically like, oh, you think you love love? Well, like love will fuck you up. She does this with In the Cut. She does that with Portrait of a Lady. And she also does that with Power of the Dog, which we will discuss in the next episode. And it's interesting to me that like her romantic films are like the more successful ones, whereas I think like her sort of like angrier ones or her Lilith Fair ones are the ones like until Power of the Dog that like I think like are so full of feeling but just like don't quite work. Even though I think she feels both of those polarities like very strongly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that this like has a stronger emotional through line than it does a narrative one. But it's like, as you said up at the top, I think she's still like working through some of her like art school stuff in here, not in a bad way, but just in a way where she's like, well, I'm going to try some stuff along with the like romance that I want to explore. And I honestly enjoyed the art school stuff exploring more than the romance exploring in this at all.
I like both of them. I think like one of the reviews, apparently like one of the contemporary reviews that came out were something like, oh, so this is just like about like a bad marriage, like why should I care? But there are like a million movies about bad marriages and
a million bad marriages.
I think what like really struck out to me watching this from the vantage point of 2021 was that, I mean, it's essentially about like financial abuse. It's about a wealthy woman who is exploited by like a guy who basically takes control of all of her money and then like socially isolates her so that like she is completely under his thumb and she is told like she can't leave the house. Some months ago, I reviewed the TV show Maid, which is also very much about financial abuse. And I was like, oh, this is like the same thing, except one of them happens to a contemporary like working class woman. And this is about like a rich woman. But I think the other thing I really enjoyed sort of like in the back of my mind that like the film doesn't quite get into, but which I think is like an undeniable undercurrent of the film, is that, you know, like all she really wants is independence. And then she gets all of this money in order to become this independent woman. And it turns out like the money makes her a target and the money is sort of like her downfall.
And also she's too naive to actually be independent. Like that's part of what's going on here is that like, yes, it would be great if she were this independent worldly woman, but then she like doesn't actually have the, for lack of a better term, street smarts to like actually hang on to that. And that's why she becomes such an easy mark.
I had two thoughts about that. One of which is, as good as Nicole Kidman is in this, I think she was slightly miscast. Because Nicole Kidman, in her 200,000 roles that she's played on screen, always radiates intelligence. And I didn't quite believe that this version by Nicole Kidman was that dumb to like fall for such a cheap schemester like John Malkovich's character. The other thing is that apparently when Campion was living in Europe as a young woman, she had a friend in Italy, I believe, who was arrested for cocaine trafficking, and she was completely destabilized by this experience, which anyone would be, because she just had no idea, but because she had so little idea of like what was actually happening, she was paranoid for a while that she would also be arrested and like her life would also be ruined. And so, yeah, street smarts. Campion also said that basically, like, she thought while playing Isabel Archer, she was basically playing some version of Jane. I think in the book, Isabel's father squanders basically like his entire fortune, which is actually Campion's story because Campion's father married a rich heiress, her mother, and then basically squandered that fortune.
Good thing film school was cheap.
And also, Campion has said that, quote, Isabel fantasizes about men like Osmond, and so do I.
I mean, so do I. But also
Mean men. I mean, that is your type. Mean
Inkoo.
white men.
Yeah, yes, have we met? But also, like, isn't every protagonist that Jane creates a version of herself?
I mean, I think she's someone who definitely likes to put a lot of herself in the movies that she makes. We should talk about those film school flourishes because I think that was probably the thing that like you and I both liked the most.
I mean, from the first moment, from the opening of the credits, where it's this voiceover of New Zealand women and
In black and white.
In black and white. Well, there's like one or two shots of color, but yeah, mostly in black and white, and they're just kind of like looking at the screen, and they're all in modern dress, and it's a like very contemporary moment before we get taken to the period in a like kind of setting, at least I perceived it as like kind of setting the scene of like, this is a story that happened, but it's also like a thing that people still experience. And also like every line that these women are sharing is basically about like their opinions on love and particularly like how it starts out great and then doesn't necessarily stay great. And so she's kind of trying to illustrate from the top that like, this is a story that continues to happen.
Yeah, I'm sorry to bring up Sex and the City once again, but I am mid rewatch. And there is like a scene where Carrie goes on and on about how like she's like this is like what's so great about like a first kiss or like anticipating the first kiss or whatever. And it's basically exactly what these like very young women are saying. And the whole idea of like the kiss being like the best thing and then like the rest of the relationship going sour is such a incredibly depressing idea for me. But I think also really gets at this like Bluebeard quality that so much of this thing is about, and also a folktale that was referenced in The Piano. Mm-hmm. I think that I would probably describe this movie as like a combination of Bluebeard and Dangerous Liaisons. And
it's very Dangerous Liaisons forward.
Yes. And Malkovich basically plays exactly the same character that he did in Dangerous Liaisons.
And it's still pretty hot.
I will not endorse that statement. I will say that Campion apparently offered Malkovich a different role in the movie, and I wanted to ask you which role you think that she initially offered Malkovich.
The dying uncle. I'm kidding.
He's so old.
I know. I assume that it's the character that Martin Donovan ended up playing, her cousin.
Yes.
To Touch It. Ralph Touchett.
Yes. By the way, the names in this movie are crazy. Did you know that Viggo Mortensen's character, Viggo Mortensen, also playing a suitor to Isabel, is named Goodwood?
Yeah, it's weird.
My favorite, like, by far art school flourish was the foursome fantasy that we have, like, very early in the movie, where I think, like, basically, like, the first scene, or, like, the second, I think one of the earliest scenes of the movie is where Richard E. Grant proposes marriage to Isabel. And she's like, no, thank you. And then Viggo Mortensen comes over and he's like, will you marry me? And she's like, no, thank you. And like very clearly her cousin is interested in her. I did roll my eyes slightly And that sort of like did make me a little bit reluctant to like get fully into the movie because I was like, okay, I get it. Like everyone wants to fuck you. Like what?
She's
are you
so
watching Top of the Lake?
popular. Yeah.
And then we get this like really fun sequence where after Viggo Mortensen leaves, like just after touching her face as he leaves, she sort of like touches her own face with her own hand, sort of like remembering that touch, and then places like her forehead on like these like beads that are hanging over her bed canopy, and then basically just like lies in bed imagining all three men going to town like on her at the same time. And
Sign me up.
And it's just this like beautiful image of like wanton horniness and sort of this like inchoateness and this like desire to have like everything all at once instead of having to settle for just one guy. I think the scene definitely riled up the James purists out there. But I don't care. It's one of the best scenes in the entire goddamn movie.
Well, it is until it isn't. I mean, I loved that scene too. It was great. I love a dream sequence like that. But then, I'm sorry, Jane did one of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen in a Jane Campion film, which is instead of the men just like not being there when like Nicole Kidman gets off the bed, she watches them all stand up and like dissolve into nothingness in this very like 1990s Ghost Rider the TV show style dissolve. It was very, very cheesy.
Did you ever watch The Secret World of Alex Mack?
Oh,
Because
of course.
those were like the same level of special effects there.
Yes. Oh, 100%. Like, I would love to ask Jane about that moment because it is literally the most embarrassing thing I've ever seen in a movie of hers.
We do get one final art school flourish, which is it's this black and white sequence. It's sort of like home movies if home movies existed like in the 1870s.
Well, Jane loves a home movie.
And the whole thing is sort of like in like this like very sped up black and white. It's very dreamlike. There is a plate of lima beans at some point, and like all the lima beans have mouths. And the lima beans keep repeating what John Malkovich's character tells her right before she leaves for Egypt, which is where she's traveling to, where the beans just keep saying, "I'm absolutely in love with you." And I think there's also a point at which, when she first meets Osmond, Malkovich's character, he holds his daughter just like a little bit too closely. Like he has his hand like very possessively like around her stomach, and then she imagines him doing the same thing to her own stomach like in this dream sequence. And yeah, it just reminded me of like every single like feeling you have as like a teenage girl where like you have like one comment some guy said and then you just like reverberate like around that comment mentally for like a whole like 3 months. That was
I've been
like
there.
the feeling. I know you've been there.
I absolutely love this scene. If the sexy foursome was your favorite, this one was mine. It was just so peculiar and specific and out of touch with the reality of this world that it was exciting. And I loved the mouths of lima beans. It also kind of like reminded me a little bit of Talk to Her in the like Charlie Chaplin vaudevillian feeling of the like fast pacedness, but also just like the weirdness of the imagery. It was really cool. And I wish she had done more of it in like later films. I appreciate the like little flashes that we get of it in her later works, but like, it was just so cool.
Yeah, it feels ragged and obviously out of touch here. In this like otherwise like very conventional period drama. But I think we sort of need like that interiority within Isabel. I will say, I think one of the things that like I felt very disappointed by with this movie is that Isabel is supposed to go through a bunch of these like really significant changes after her marriage, and I kind of found it like hard to like sense them. There's like a point where like two suitors after she gets married, two previous suitors are like, oh, she's so cold now, and I'm like, she kind of seems like she was like the way she always was. And so, like, number one, I think this probably should have been like a miniseries. It has like too much scope for even a 2.5 hour movie. But number two, we get so little interiority with Isabel that I really appreciated that moment of just like being really, really, really inside her head.
Well, and it's something that Jane has clearly, she's done something like it before. I would say specifically in The Piano, where we have the scene where we have just like the flash of the man on fire. That's like a cartoon drawing. That's like a child's drawing.
And also Sweetie.
What in Sweetie? Which one in Sweetie?
I don't know. Just like these like weird flourishes of like the tree like destroying everything in its path.
Oh, right. Yeah. And then also I'm thinking of In the Cut with the like
the sepia tone
memory of the legs getting cut off by the ice skate.
Yeah.
Like all of these moments that are out of place and not of the like narrative of the world, as a way to like really get at the interiority of these characters and what they're going through, or like what their history is, or kind of like where their mind is. And it does a really good job of illustrating that in a way that like doesn't feel telegraphy.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want that in something like The Power of the Dog or the first season of Top of the Lake. I think like those have a certain like intensity to them that I don't want to be distracted from. But with something like Portrait of a Lady or Sweetie or An Angel at My Table even.
Also, holy smoke with when he sees Kate Winslet as the goddess. Yeah.
I let Campion be Campion, man.
Yeah, weird out, girl.
There is a point where Osmond Malkovich's character said something about like, well, I think I'm just like extra virtuous because I've never tried to make any money. And another quote I ran into in my research for this is that Campion has said that not only has she been attracted to Osmonds in her life, but she said, when I was young and falling in love, I did a con job on myself, occasionally with very unsuitable people. Which I think like adds just this like very like relatable aura to like the whole film. But also I just kept thinking like, how many art school bozos did you run into and like make yourself fall in love with? Where they were like, oh, I think I'm like too good to get a job, actually.
Very, very, I've chosen my publisher energy from Angel at My Table.
But yeah, it just sort of made me think.
She's really tearing apart the men that she has also had in her past, it seems.
Yes, that's like exactly like the energy. But then also that just like adds to the pathos of Isabel's plight, because this is a world in which women are not allowed to make mistakes. Like when you settle for like a man, like that is like basically the rest of your life that you are gambling on. And there's this sort of like sense, I think with a lot of marriage plot driven period dramas, there is this sort of sense that like a woman is the person who is doing the choosing, but she is basically choosing her warden, right? So like the most you can hope for is that you have like a really, really nice warden.
Do you?
And I do not have a 19th century marriage.
Really, let's be real. You're Dan's warden.
Yes. Hi, Dan, who's not listening to this.
Nope.
So yeah, it definitely just, I don't know, made me really relieved that I don't live in this period of time and I don't have like a huge amount of money that I would be at Target. I will say, I understood why Isabel went for Osmond, part of which is that what she wants initially is to be a more worldly person, and he sort of has these like trappings of worldliness. He lives in Italy, and he has all of these knickknacks, and he just sort of like carries himself as someone who is really cosmopolitan, and so I understood why she was into him. I also feel like, and again, I think this goes back to like me sort of wishing this was a miniseries. I think if you had sort of seen that 180 turn a little bit more, it would have been more convincing. I think we get like a little bit of it where when he's so courting her, he says something like, oh, like, I think your Inkoo is beautiful, or like, I can't wait to see it, or something. And then like once they get married, he's like, stop being so angry. Which again, like, I think felt very like modern in that sense. But I just really wish that like we could see what made him attractive a little bit more. He has a very sharp tongue, which I really liked. There's one point where he calls his daughter a little dusty, which woof. And I think one of our favorite lines from the movie was when he's being asked to basically meet her, and he's like, I know too many dingy people already.
I love my dingy friends.
He has this like fun, sharp, velvety tongue, and yet I just wish like we got like one extra scene or something in there where like her complete besottedness to him or of him like made a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that I would have liked to see a little bit more of the whole journey of their relationship, like the courtship, falling in love, why we should be attracted to him, but also then kind of seeing the turn play out.
Yeah.
Because we just jump a year forward and then the turn has already happened at some point in that.
Yeah.
Rather than like seeing him become the villain.
Yeah. You want to see that transformation. And I think because his character is all, again, like so similar to his character in Dangerous Liaisons, there's a sort of like, well, like he already knows how to do this role already. Like it's such a John Malkovich-y, like typecast role that if he's not bringing something new to the table, you're kind of like, I've already seen this performance before from him and like in a better movie. So why am I watching this? The other thing that I think kind of detracts from the movie's pleasurability is that, like, there were so few supporting characters that you could sort of grab onto to, like, get invested in. Initially, we think that Mary Louise Parker's character might be someone like that. She's sort of this, like, dumpy lady reporter who's very, like, pugnacious and very, like, protective of her friend. And then you immediately find out that, like, number one, Mary Louise Parker cannot play this role because she is way too contemporary. It was, if any role screamed for Melanie Lynskey to play, like, that was that role. I found Barbara Hershey's, like, character, the one who sort of, like, sets Isabel up for all of this and then has these really big pangs of regret. Like, I didn't find her particularly sympathetic. I think that Malkovich's daughter was also just like such a nothing. I think the only character who, and then of course all of the suitors, like, are just these like cardboard cutout men. Viggo Mortensen is beautiful here, but you know, he's just like, he kind of gave me like Kevin Bacon from In the Cut vibes, like basically like a stalker without any depth.
Yeah. They're very white bread, all the guys.
I mean, your fave. Your favorite flavor. Richard E. Grant is completely wasted. Martin Donovan, I thought, was just like a wet rag. Just like offered nothing. He was. I
feel like he's a wet rag in everything that he's in. And like usually when he's in that role, he's good at that. But this did not call for a wet rag.
Yeah.
It called for more of a, not Ben Whishaw, but that kind of like young romantic Keats ardent character vibe. Yes, ardent.
Yeah. So like I think he came across more creepy than he meant to. There were only two supporting actors I really liked in this. One was Christian Bale, who also had a really written role, but he really brought the Christian Bale intensity that like you wanted. And also, we think of Christian Bale so much as like Batman now. But he really kills it every time he's in a period drama, honestly. And the other person I really liked in this was Shelley Duvall because
Ugh.
she
She was so perfect.
she was just like the comic relief you so desperately needed in this.
She was just a kook.
Yeah. She was just like a really self-important kook. I got like a bit of like Janice Soprano vibes and just like her complete like narcissistic self-delusion. But honestly, like the supporting characters that like I enjoyed the most in this movie probably were all of the dogs, because so many of the characters had these like dog analogs. And I was like, yeah, just give me more dogs because none of the characters are actually interesting. And so I just wanted to see like Campion matching her actors with like the dogs of their choice. One other thing I wanted to note about this is that there's a sort of like carryover from previous period films that Campion has done in her absolute love of really ugly period details. This is a very sumptuous film, but Campion also loves just like the weird details of like historical times. Mary Louise Parker's glasses are just so ugly. It reminded me of Holly Hunter's insane hair in The Piano.
Oh, and Nicole Kidman's insane hair in this.
Yes, she has
When she starts out with like the boobs on her head.
Yes, it's an incredibly unflattering hairstyle and hair color. And, you know, like you imagine 90s Nicole Kidman with that glorious like Titian red curls. And for her to get this like, for her to be this like very beautiful character, but just have this like wet poodle looking fur hair. Yeah.
Yeah. Her dog is a wet poodle.
Let's talk about the ending. So one of the things that Campion changed from the book is that there is supposed to be this like very intense ambiguity between like whether she goes back to Rome or whether she goes back to Goodwood, the guy played by Viggo Mortensen, who is like, well, like, you know, you can just get divorced and then come marry me. And he kisses her, and then I guess like you're supposed to feel like she was also into it because she kisses him back. But I think that's just like one of those other things where the character just like didn't really work for me because he's so creepy and so persistent and won't take no for an answer for so much of the movie. And so, yeah, I was like, why is this guy like assaulting her basically? And then she like runs back to her dead cousin's house, and then she sort of seems like she's about to go in, and then she faces the camera and like she faces outside, and it goes into this like really unfortunate slow-mo about like what is the decision she's going to make, and it's sort of like it ends on a note of ambiguity about whether she's going to go back to Goodwood or not. And I was just like, this doesn't work for me.
I don't know. I think it worked for me a little better than you, because at least the way that I read it is like, I thought she was into the kiss with Viggo Mortensen and was like excited to rediscover that like young passion that she doesn't have in her marriage anymore.
Yeah.
And so she like gets really into the kiss, but then like breaks from it and runs away from him, running back to this house that as she gets back to it, we see through the window pane, the bright green room that we felt was much more belonging in an Almodovar film than this film. But the bright green room where she first met Serena, where she first met the woman who basically led to her her own doom. And so rather than like go back into that room that reminds her of all of that, she kind of like turns back around to the outside, kind of like remembering her freedom. At least that's kind of how I read it.
Okay. I mean, I'll take that. But
like, I mean, ending ambiguously means that like we can read it however we want.
But I want closure. I feel like the stakes are just so high that, and like the character is not compellingly drawn enough that I didn't feel really moved by the ambiguity. I think like if the stakes were lower, or if this was like a much more detailed character portrait, then it could have worked for me. But, you know, I've already talked about all of this other stuff already.
But it was already a portrait of a lady.
Shut up.
Never.
You want to do rankings?
Let's do them.
I will start. This has gotten truly like quite difficult now. I still think the piano is her best work. I'm going to put Holy Smoke in there, and then Top of the Lake, and then Bright Star. Geez. I think Portrait of a Lady, In the Cut, Sweetie, Angel at My Table, and then at the very bottom, Top of the Lake Season 2.
All right. That's a good ranking, but this is really tough now.
Yeah.
There's so many choices.
We have 2 new elements now.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, the top of the list is Holy Smoke. And then the piano. Then Top of the Lake, Season 1, and then Bright Star. We're agreement in those, at least. Then, honestly, I would say Sweetie. Followed by Portrait of a Lady.
Wow.
Then In the Cut.
Wow.
Then Angel at My Table. And then Top of the Lake Season 2.
Okay, so we still agree that Top of the Lake Season 2 is the worst thing she's ever done.
Yeah, more like Season Poo.
No.
I'm obviously cutting that.
No, you're obviously keeping that.
Gross. All right, well, thank you so much for listening. We're so glad you joined us for this double feature. Our next episode, and our last, is on Power of the Dog. It'll be out in 2 weeks or so. And if you'd like to email us, we're at allaboutfilmpod@gmail.com.